He laughed when the single dad's son showed up for the new job. Before we dive in, let's light up this comment section with hearts from every corner of the world. The morning fog still clung to downtown Seattle's glass towers when Marcus Thompson pushed his mop cart through the marble halls of Blackstone International. At 32, his weathered hands told stories of late nights and early mornings, all for his 6-year-old son, Tommy. The divorce 3 years ago had left him with custody, 2 jobs, and dreams that seemed further away each passing day. "Mr. Thompson," called Sarah, the HR director, her heels clicking against the floor. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Marcus paused, anxiety creeping up his spine. Had he missed a spot somewhere? Was his job in jeopardy? "We're posting a translator position tomorrow," Sarah continued, her voice carrying excitement. 15 languages required, starting at $200,000 annually. "I thought you might know someone interested." Marcus nearly dropped his mop. 200,000. That was more than he made in 5 years combined. Thank you, Mom, but I don't think I know anyone who speaks 15 languages." Sarah smiled warmly. "Well, if you think of someone, let me know. Mr. Blackstone needs this position filled urgently." That evening, Marcus sat at their tiny kitchen table, helping Tommy with homework. At 6 years old, his son was already reading books meant for high schoolers. But it wasn't just English that flowed from Tommy's lips. "Papa, can we go to the park tomorrow?" Tommy asked, then seamlessly switched to Spanish, French, and Mandarin, cycling through languages like they were toys. Marcus stared at his son, his heart pounding. Tommy didn't just speak these languages. He understood complex grammar, cultural nuances, and could translate between them effortlessly. It was a gift that had emerged naturally, almost mysteriously, over the past 2 years. Could it be possible? Could his 6-year-old son be the answer to both their prayers? The next morning, Marcus found himself standing outside CEO Richard Blackstone's office, Tommy's small hand clasped tightly in his own. The boy wore his best shirt, still too small from last year, and looked up at his father with complete trust. "Sir," Marcus knocked hesitantly, "I'm here about the translator position." "Come in," boomed a deep voice. Richard Blackstone sat behind a desk the size of Marcus's entire living room. At 55, the billionaire commanded respect with his silver hair and sharp suit. But when he looked up and saw Marcus holding a child's hand, his expression shifted to complete bewilderment. "I'm sorry, Thompson, but I think there's been a misunderstanding. This is a business meeting, not bring your child to work day." "Actually, sir," Marcus's voice trembled, "he's here for the interview." Silence filled the enormous office. Richard Blackstone's pen froze mid-signature as he processed what the janitor had just said. Slowly, he removed his reading glasses and leaned back in his leather chair. "I'm sorry, did you just tell me that this 6-year-old is here to interview for a senior translator position requiring fluency in 15 languages? Tommy stepped forward, his small voice clear and confident. "Good morning, Mr. Blackstone. My name is Thomas Marcus Thompson. I'm delighted to meet you," he said, then continued introducing himself in perfect French, Italian, and Mandarin. Richard's eyes widened as Tommy continued seamlessly in Russian, Arabic, and Japanese, introducing himself with perfect pronunciation and culturally appropriate formalities in each language. "This is impossible," Richard whispered, pressing his intercom. "Sarah, cancel my next 3 meetings." Marcus watched his boss's face transform from skeptical amusement to genuine astonishment. "Sir, I know it seems crazy, but Tommy has been speaking like this since he was 4. The doctors say it's some kind of exceptional linguistic intelligence." "Tommy," Richard said carefully, "can you translate this?" He pulled out a complex German contract from his desk drawer. "This is a merger document with specific legal terminology." Tommy studied the document for 30 seconds, then began translating not just word for word, but explaining legal nuances and cultural implications that even surprised Richard's legal team when they later verified it. "My goodness," Richard muttered in German. "You speak German very well, Mr. Blackstone," Tommy replied in German, "but your accent shows you're from Bavaria, isn't that right?" Richard nearly fell out of his chair. The child had just correctly identified his Bavarian accent, something most German speakers couldn't detect. "How did you—" Richard started, then caught himself. This wasn't just talent. This was a gift that defied explanation. Marcus cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, I know this is unconventional, but we really need this opportunity. Tommy's brilliant, but he's still just a kid who needs his father around. If there's any way—" Richard studied the pair before him, a hard-working single father and a child prodigy who could revolutionize international business. His mind raced with possibilities, but also with concerns. How could he possibly hire a 6-year-old? What would the board say? What would the world think? But as Tommy continued demonstrating his linguistic abilities, switching between Mandarin business negotiations and Arabic poetry recitations, Richard realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. "Tommy," Richard said slowly, "what do you want to be when you grow up?" The boy's eyes lit up. "I want to help people understand each other. Sometimes grown-ups fight because they can't talk to each other properly. I think I can help fix that." Richard felt something shift in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since building his first company. The following week, Richard Blackstone found himself doing something he'd never done in 30 years of business, scheduling a board meeting to discuss hiring a 6-year-old. "Richard, you've called emergency meetings before," said Margaret Chen, his chief financial officer, "but this might be your most interesting request yet." Indeed, the boardroom filled with 12 of the most powerful business minds in Seattle. Richard had spent sleepless nights preparing for this moment, knowing his reputation hung in the balance. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, "what I'm about to propose will challenge everything we believe about conventional hiring practices." He pressed play on the recording he'd made of Tommy's interview. For 20 minutes, the board listened in stunned silence as the 6-year-old navigated complex translations, cultural negotiations, and linguistic puzzles that had stumped their previous translation team. "This is remarkable," whispered Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the board's education consultant, "but surely there are legal and ethical considerations." "Absolutely," Richard nodded. "Which is why I've spent the week researching child labor laws, educational requirements, and consulting with child psychologists. This wouldn't be traditional employment. It would be a specialized consulting arrangement with strict educational and developmental protections." Board member James Morrison leaned forward. "Richard, I have to ask, why are you really pushing for this? You could hire any professional translator in the world." Richard paused, remembering his conversation with Tommy 3 days earlier. The boy had asked about Richard's own children, and when he'd admitted he had none, Tommy had simply said, "That must be lonely sometimes. Maybe we could be your family while we work together." Because sometimes," Richard said quietly, "the most extraordinary solutions come from the most unexpected places. This child doesn't just translate words, he bridges worlds." Margaret reviewed her notes. "The financial terms you're proposing are generous. Full salary for Marcus as Tommy's educational supervisor, plus consulting fees that would make Tommy one of the highest-paid consultants in the country." "Money isn't the issue," Richard replied. "The question is whether we're brave enough to embrace something unprecedented." The vote was closer than Richard had hoped. 7 in favor, 5 against. But it was enough. That afternoon, Richard called Marcus with the news. "We're moving forward, but with conditions. Tommy will work maximum 4 hours daily, only on days he doesn't have school. And we're hiring a private tutor to ensure his education remains the priority." Marcus's voice broke over the phone. "Sir, I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Richard chuckled. "Wait until you see what we're asking Tommy to handle first." The next morning brought their first real test, a video conference with executives from Tokyo, São Paulo, and Berlin, all simultaneously. A deal worth $50 million hung in the balance, and miscommunication had stalled negotiations for months. Tommy sat in a specially adjusted chair, his small hands folded professionally as 3 different languages erupted from the conference speakers. What happened next would change everything. The conference room crackled with tension as 6 screens displayed frustrated executives from 3 continents. For 2 months, Blackstone International's biggest merger had been stalled due to cultural misunderstandings and translation errors. "Tommy," Richard whispered, "are you ready for this?" The 6-year-old nodded solemnly, adjusting the small headset that dwarfed his head. "I think they're all saying the same thing, but in different ways. They're scared of each other." Richard blinked. In one sentence, Tommy had identified what weeks of professional mediation had missed. "Good morning, gentlemen," Tommy began, addressing the German executives with formal respect. Then he switched to Japanese, bowing slightly toward the camera. "Good morning. Nice to meet you. I'm Thomas." The room fell silent as Tommy continued in Portuguese, introducing himself to the Brazilian team with perfect accent and cultural awareness. "Now," Tommy said in English, then repeated in all 3 languages, "everyone is worried about the same thing. They think the other companies might not honor the agreement. But Mr. Schmidt, when you said you need more security, you meant you need guarantees, not that you don't trust them. And Mr. Tanaka, when you said trust relationships are important, you were trying to build trust, not question their integrity." One by one, Tommy addressed each executive's specific concerns, translating not just words but intentions and emotions. He explained cultural contexts that had been lost in previous translations, bridging gaps that professional diplomats had failed to cross. Within 30 minutes, what had seemed like an impossible deadlock began to dissolve. The German executives started nodding. The Japanese team smiled. The Brazilian CEO leaned forward with renewed interest. "Incredible," whispered Sarah, who had been watching from the corner. "He's not just translating, he's healing." 2 hours later, the merger was signed. $50 million in deals that had seemed hopeless were suddenly moving forward. But more importantly, 3 teams of strangers had become partners. That evening, Richard found Tommy in the company library, reading a book about different cultures around the world. "Tommy, what you did today was extraordinary. How did you know what they were really feeling?" Tommy looked up with those wise eyes that seemed too old for his 6-year-old face. "Papa taught me that when people are angry or scared, it's usually because they feel alone. So I tried to help them feel less alone." Richard sat down beside the boy, something he'd never done with any employee. "Your father raised you well. He tries really hard," Tommy said quietly. "Sometimes I hear him crying at night when he thinks I'm asleep. He worries about money and if he's good enough to take care of me. But he is. He's the best papa ever." Richard felt his throat tighten. When was the last time anyone had spoken about him with such pure love? "Tommy, would you like to know a secret? I used to have a son a long time ago." Tommy's eyes widened. What happened to him? "I was so busy building my company that I forgot to build a relationship with him. By the time I realized what mattered most, it was too late. He moved far away, and we don't talk anymore." Tommy was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached over and patted Richard's hand with his small fingers. "It's never too late, Mr. Blackstone. Maybe he's just scared too. Maybe he thinks you don't want to talk to him." That night, for the first time in 15 years, Richard Blackstone stared at his phone, wondering if he had the courage to call his son. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Richard discovered that having Tommy around was changing more than just business deals. The boy had a way of noticing things that adults missed, asking questions that cut straight to the heart of problems. "Mr. Blackstone," Tommy said one Thursday afternoon, looking up from a stack of international contracts, "why do all these agreements sound so angry? It's like everyone expects the other person to be mean." Richard paused his own work. "What do you mean, buddy?" "Well, listen to this." Tommy picked up a document. "This says, Party A agrees to fulfill obligations under penalty of. Why not just say, we promise to do our best and help each other succeed?" Sarah, who had been filing nearby, stopped and stared. "Tommy, that's actually brilliant. These contracts are written like we expect everyone to fail." That afternoon, Richard called an emergency meeting with the legal department. I want you to review our standard contract language. My 6-year-old consultant thinks we sound too aggressive, and I'm starting to think he's right. Meanwhile, Marcus was experiencing his own transformation. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't working nights. He was home for dinner, helping with homework, reading bedtime stories. The financial pressure that had consumed him was lifting, and he was rediscovering what it meant to be a father, instead of just a survivor. "Papa," Tommy said one evening as they walked through downtown Seattle, "do you think Mr. Blackstone is lonely?" Marcus considered the question. "Why do you ask?" "He stays at work really late, even when all the meetings are done. And he never talks about going home to family. Today, I asked him what his favorite dinner was, and he said whatever the chef at my club makes. That sounds lonely." The next day, Marcus found himself doing something unprecedented. He knocked on Richard Blackstone's office door at 7 p.m. "Sir, Tommy and I were wondering if you'd like to join us for dinner tonight. Nothing fancy, just spaghetti and meatballs. But Tommy makes excellent garlic bread." Richard looked up from his paperwork, surprise flickering across his face. That's very kind, but I couldn't impose." "No imposition, sir. Tommy specifically requested I ask. He says you look hungry for more than just food." And an hour later, Richard Blackstone sat at a small kitchen table in a modest apartment, watching a 6-year-old boy explain his homework, while his father stirred sauce on a stove that had seen better days. "This is nice," Richard said quietly. "What?" Marcus called from the kitchen. "This. Family dinner. I haven't had one in 15 years. Tommy looked up from his math problems. "Why not?" "I guess I forgot how," Richard admitted. "It's easy," Tommy said matter-of-factly. "You just sit with people you care about and talk about your day. Papa says the secret ingredient isn't in the food, it's in paying attention to each other." That night, as Richard drove home to his empty penthouse, he realized something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in decades, work wasn't enough anymore. He wanted more of what he'd experienced at that small kitchen table. The next morning brought a call that would test everything they'd built together. "Sir," Sarah's voice was tight with concern, "we have a situation. Channel 7 News just called. They want to do a story about the child employee at Blackstone International. Someone leaked information about Tommy." Richard's blood ran cold. In one phone call, their carefully protected arrangement was about to become a media circus. The newsroom erupted with activity as Channel 7's investigative team prepared their exposé. Child labor at Blackstone International flashed across monitors while producers assembled clips and scheduled interviews. Richard paced his office like a caged tiger, his legal team assembled around the conference table. "How did this leak?" "We had agreements, confidentiality clauses." "Sir," Sarah interrupted, "they already have footage of Tommy entering the building. Someone's been watching us for weeks." Marcus sat in the corner, his face pale with terror. Everything they'd built, everything they'd dreamed of, was about to crumble. Worse, his son would be thrust into a spotlight no child should face. "We need to get ahead of this," advised Jennifer Walsh, Blackstone's crisis communications expert. "Full damage control. Distance the company from the arrangement immediately." "Absolutely not." Richard's voice cut through the room like ice. "We don't abandon family." The word hung in the air. Family. When had Richard started thinking of Marcus and Tommy as family? "Sir," Jennifer pressed, "this could destroy the company's reputation. Child labor accusations, exploitation charges." "Then we tell the truth," Richard said firmly. "All of it." 2 hours later, Tommy sat between Richard and his father at a press conference, his small hands folded calmly as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, "I called this conference to address concerns about our arrangement with Thomas Thompson. But first, let me tell you what really happened." For 20 minutes, Richard spoke from his heart instead of a script. He talked about discovering extraordinary talent in an unexpected place, about building protective structures around a gifted child, about finding family where he least expected it. But don't take my word for it, Richard concluded. Ask Tommy yourself. Dean, the first reporter, was aggressive. Tommy, do you feel like you're being forced to work instead of playing like other kids? Tommy looked directly into the camera with those wise 6-year-old eyes. I help people understand each other better. That doesn't feel like work to me. It feels like being useful, like making the world a little bit better. What about your education, your childhood? I still go to school every day. I still play with toys and watch cartoons. But now my papa doesn't cry at night anymore because he's worried about money. And Mr. Blackstone isn't lonely anymore because we eat dinner together sometimes. Isn't that what work should do? Make people's lives better? The room fell silent. Even the most cynical reporters found themselves moved by the boy's simple wisdom. The next question came from an older journalist. Richard, what do you say to critics who claim you're exploiting this situation? Richard looked at Tommy, then at Marcus. 6 months ago, I was a successful businessman who went home to an empty house every night. I had everything money could buy and nothing that actually mattered. Tommy didn't just bring linguistic skills to my company. He brought something I'd forgotten existed. Hope, joy, purpose beyond profit. That evening, the story that aired wasn't the exposé Channel 7 had planned. Instead, it became a human interest piece about an unlikely family, an extraordinary gift, and a corporation learning that success could be measured in more than dollars. But as the cameras faded and the reporters left, Richard received a phone call that would change everything once again. Dad? The voice on the other end was hesitant, familiar, and filled with 15 years of unspoken emotion. Michael? Richard's voice broke. Son? Is that really you? Richard's hands trembled as he held the phone, 15 years of regret and longing, compressed into a single moment. Michael's voice, now deeper and more mature, carried across the miles from Chicago where he worked as a social worker. Dad, I saw the news story about you and that little boy, Tommy. Michael's voice wavered. I've been thinking about calling for months, but after seeing how you've changed, how you've become the father I always hoped you could be. Richard closed his eyes, memories flooding back. Michael at 6, begging for bedtime stories that never came because of late meetings. Michael at 12, accepting that his father wouldn't make another school play. Michael at 18, walking away without looking back. Son, I was wrong about everything. I let work consume me, and I lost the most important thing in my life, you. I know, Dad, but watching you with Tommy and his father, you've learned something I never thought you could. You've learned what family really means. Tommy, who had been coloring quietly nearby, looked up with concern when he saw tears streaming down Richard's face. The boy walked over and gently took Richard's free hand. Michael, Richard's voice strengthened, there's someone here who would like to meet you, someone who taught me that it's never too late to be the man you should have been all along. 3 days later, Michael Blackstone stepped off a plane in Seattle, his heart pounding with nervous anticipation. At 33, he looked remarkably like his father had at that age, determined jaw, intelligent eyes, but with something Richard had never possessed. Compassion earned through helping others heal from their own family traumas. The airport reunion was electric with emotion. Tommy waited at the gate beside Richard and Marcus, holding a carefully crafted welcome sign, written in 5 different languages. When Michael appeared, tired from his red-eye flight, but eager to reconnect, Tommy stepped forward with the formal politeness that had charmed international executives. Hello, Mr. Michael. I'm Tommy Thompson. Your father talks about you every day now. He says you help children like me, but ones who don't have good papas like mine. Michael knelt to Tommy's eye level, his professional composure cracking. Years of working with troubled children had taught him to read pain and hope in young faces, but Tommy's expression held something different. Pure, uncomplicated love for the man Michael had spent decades learning to forgive. Hello, Tommy. Thank you for taking such good care of my dad. He takes care of us too, Tommy replied seriously. That's what families do. That simple statement hit Michael like a physical blow. This 6-year-old had accomplished what 15 years of therapy, counseling, and personal growth had failed to achieve. He'd given Michael a glimpse of the father Richard could have been. That evening, the four of them sat around Marcus's small kitchen table, the same table where Richard had rediscovered what family dinner meant. The conversation flowed naturally, as if they'd been doing this for years instead of hours. Michael listened as Tommy demonstrated his linguistic abilities, translating bedtime stories into different languages with the unconscious ease of breathing. But more importantly, he watched his father's face transform with each small interaction. "It's remarkable," Michael told Richard later as they walked through downtown Seattle, the city lights reflecting their complicated emotions. "But more remarkable is watching you with him. You're present in a way you never were with me." Richard stopped walking, the weight of his past failures settling on his shoulders. "I learned too late with you, but maybe it's not too late for us." Michael studied his father's face in the streetlight glow. "Dad, I've spent 15 years helping kids whose parents couldn't prioritize them. I became a social worker because I understood their pain. I built my entire career around healing the wounds that absent fathers create. But seeing you now, maybe some wounds can heal." They walked in comfortable silence for several blocks, processing years of hurt and hope. "What changed you?" Michael finally asked. "What made Tommy different from me?" Richard considered the question carefully. Maybe it wasn't that Tommy was different. Maybe it was that I was ready to see what I'd been missing. Maybe losing you taught me to recognize what matters, even if it took me 15 years to understand the lesson. The next morning brought unexpected news that would test their newfound family bonds in ways none of them anticipated. But for one perfect evening, Richard Blackstone had his son back, and the possibility of redemption felt real for the first time in decades. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell from Seattle Children's Hospital sat across from Richard, Marcus, and Tommy in Richard's office, her expression grave but kind. As one of the country's leading pediatric neurologists, she'd been studying Tommy's case for 2 weeks after Richard had insisted on comprehensive medical evaluations to ensure they weren't inadvertently harming the boy. "What Tommy possesses is beyond exceptional," she began carefully, adjusting her thick-rimmed glasses as she reviewed her notes. "His linguistic processing centers show activity patterns we've never documented in medical literature. The neural pathways responsible for language acquisition are not just active, they're hyperactive, to a degree that's both fascinating and concerning." Marcus felt his world tilt. After everything they'd built, after finally finding stability and purpose, were they about to lose it all? What kind of concerns? "Tommy's brain is processing information at rates that are unprecedented for a child his age. Think of it like a high-performance race car engine, incredibly powerful, but also requiring specialized care and maintenance. The neural pathways responsible for language acquisition are operating at nearly twice the normal intensity." Richard leaned forward, his businessman's mind immediately jumping to worst-case scenarios. "Well, what does that mean exactly? Are we talking about permanent damage? Think of it like a computer processor running too fast for too long without proper cooling systems. Without proper management, there could be consequences. Severe headaches, seizures, or even permanent neurological damage. However," she continued quickly, seeing the panic in their faces, "this isn't necessarily a crisis." The room fell silent except for Tommy, who was quietly reading a German medical journal he'd found on Richard's shelf, completely oblivious to the adults discussing his future. His small fingers traced the complex scientific terminology as if it were a children's book. "However," Dr. Hartwell continued, "this isn't necessarily a crisis. With the right therapeutic approach, proper rest schedules, and careful monitoring, Tommy can continue using his gift safely. But it will require significant lifestyle adjustments and a complete restructuring of how we approach his abilities." Marcus's voice was barely a whisper. "Are you saying he can't work anymore?" "I'm saying he needs balance." No more than 2 hours of intensive translation work per day, with mandatory 45-minute rest periods between sessions. And we need to introduce cognitive exercises designed to help his brain process information more efficiently, almost like physical therapy for the mind. Tommy looked up from his journal, his young face serious but unafraid. "Dr. Hartwell, are you worried about my head hurting? Because it does sometimes, especially after really hard translations. I just thought that was normal." The doctor smiled gently, her heart aching for this remarkable child who had been carrying discomfort without complaint. "That's exactly what we need to prevent, Tommy. Your brain is like a superhero muscle. It needs proper care to stay strong and healthy for years to come." Over the following weeks, their routine transformed completely. Michael, whose background in child development proved invaluable, made the decision to move to Seattle permanently to help coordinate Tommy's care and provide the family support structure they all needed. "I've been thinking about leaving Chicago anyway," Michael explained to Richard as they set up his temporary office space. "My work there was helping me heal from our past, but maybe it's time to focus on building our future." The boys' work schedule became carefully structured. Morning school with regular classes, early afternoon rest periods, limited evening consulting sessions, and mandatory weekend breaks. They hired a specialized tutor who understood gifted children, installed proper lighting and ergonomic furniture in Tommy's workspace, and created detailed charts to monitor his energy levels and mental fatigue. But rather than diminishing their family bond, these changes strengthened it in unexpected ways. Richard learned to prioritize differently, scheduling board meetings around Tommy's rest periods and leaving important negotiations early to ensure the boy got proper care. Marcus discovered that being protective didn't mean being fearful. It meant being wise and proactive about potential challenges. "You know what's funny?" Tommy said one evening as they played board games instead of working on international contracts. "I thought being special meant doing more things than other kids, but maybe it means doing the right things better and knowing when to rest." Michael smiled at his father across the Monopoly board. "Sounds like someone's learning about balance from a very wise teacher." Richard nodded, realizing that Tommy wasn't just teaching him about languages and family. He was teaching him about sustainable success, about building something that could last for years rather than burning out in spectacular fashion. But their newfound equilibrium was about to face its greatest challenge yet. The next morning, Richard received a call that would force them to make an impossible choice between Tommy's safety and their family's survival. The voice on the phone belonged to Viktor Kozlov, one of Russia's most powerful oligarchs, speaking through a translator from Moscow. His message was simple, but chilling. He had a proposition that could make Blackstone International incredibly wealthy, or destroy them completely. "Mr. Blackstone," the translator conveyed with practiced formality, "Mr. Kozlov has heard about your young consultant through certain business channels. He has business dealings that require discreet translations. Conversations that governments would prefer remained private. He's prepared to pay $50 million for 1 month of the boy's exclusive services." Richard's blood ran cold, the phone suddenly feeling heavy in his hand. "Absolutely not. Tommy is not available for that kind of work." Mr. Kozlov anticipated your response. "Perhaps you should know that he's already acquired significant shares in your company through shell corporations over the past 6 months, enough to force a board vote on this matter. He's been watching your operation with great interest." The line went dead, leaving Richard staring at his phone in disbelief. The implied threat hung in the air like poison gas. Within hours, his legal team confirmed the nightmare. Kozlov controlled nearly 30% of Blackstone International through carefully hidden investments spanning multiple offshore entities. "He's been planning this for months," explained Robert Chen, Richard's lead attorney, spreading documents across the conference table. "These shell companies have been slowly acquiring shares through perfectly legal but deliberately obscured transactions. He can't force a hostile takeover, but he can make business impossible." Block deals, tie up operations in legal challenges, destroy your company's reputation through strategic leaks to competitors and media. That evening, Richard faced the hardest conversation of his life. Sitting around Marcus's kitchen table, with Michael providing moral support and Tommy coloring nearby, he explained the situation to his chosen family. "So he wants to use Tommy for illegal things?" Marcus asked, his protective instincts flaring as he unconsciously moved closer to his son. Not illegal exactly, but morally questionable at best. Translations of conversations between government officials, business deals that circumvent international sanctions, communications that could destabilize political situations or harm innocent people. The kind of work that would compromise everything we believe in. Michael, drawing on his social work experience with exploited children, was blunt. This is exactly the kind of situation that ruins kids' lives permanently. The psychological pressure, the moral compromise, the exposure to adult corruption. It would damage Tommy in ways that might never heal. Tommy, who had been listening quietly while continuing to color his picture of their family, spoke up without looking up from his crayons. "What happens if you say no?" Richard struggled with how to explain corporate warfare to a 6-year-old. "This man might try to hurt our company, make it very hard for us to keep working together. He might spread lies about us, or make other businesses afraid to work with us. And if you say yes, you'd have to do translations for people who might use your words to hurt other people. People in other countries who can't protect themselves." Tommy considered this with the seriousness that always amazed the adults around him. He set down his red crayon and looked directly at Richard. "Papa always says that some things are more important than money, like keeping people safe and doing what's right." "But Tommy," Marcus said gently, his heart breaking as he watched his son grapple with adult concepts no child should face, "if Mr. Blackstone loses his company, we lose everything we've built together. The foundation, the future plans, everything." "Not everything," Tommy replied with 6-year-old wisdom that cut straight to the heart of the matter. "We'd still have each other. Companies can be rebuilt, but families can't be replaced. And if I help bad people hurt good people, that would make me bad too, wouldn't it?" Michael watched his father's face transform as Tommy spoke. Here was a child offering to sacrifice his extraordinary opportunities to protect his principles, and teaching them all what real strength looked like. "There's another option," Richard said slowly, an idea forming as he watched Tommy's unwavering moral clarity. "We fight back, but it would be dangerous, uncertain, and we might lose anyway. It would mean taking risks that could put all of us in harm's way." Tommy stood up from his chair and walked to Richard, placing his small hand on the older man's arm with startling gravity. "Mr. Blackstone, you taught me that brave people don't choose the easy path. They choose the right path, even when it's scary." That night, Richard called an emergency board meeting for the following morning. It was time to find out who his real allies were, and whether love could triumph over fear when everything was on the line. The boardroom at midnight felt like a war council as Richard faced his colleagues, knowing that some of them might have already been compromised by Kozlov's influence. Michael sat beside him, lending moral support, while Marcus and Tommy waited safely at home under the protection of private security Richard had quietly arranged. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they faced, "we're facing an existential threat to everything we've built. But more importantly, we're facing a test of who we really are as human beings and as a company." He laid out Kozlov's ultimatum and the impossible choice it represented, presenting the financial documents that proved the oligarchs' growing control over their company. Round the table, faces reflected fear, calculation, and in some cases, something that looked suspiciously like relief at having an excuse to abandon their unconventional arrangement. "The boy's talented," said James Morrison, loosening his tie as the late hour took its toll, "but he's not worth destroying the company over. Take Kozlov's deal, make the 50 million, and find another solution for the kid. Maybe set up a trust fund for his education." "Another solution?" Michael couldn't stay quiet, his social worker instincts flaring. We're talking about exploiting a 6-year-old child for potentially criminal purposes. This isn't a business decision. It's a moral one. Margaret Chen leaned forward, her usually composed demeanor cracking under pressure. Richard, I've supported you through many difficult decisions over the years, but this is business suicide. Kozlov has resources we can't match. He's connected to networks of power that span continents. Fighting him could destroy not just the company, but our personal lives as well. But Dr. Elizabeth Warren surprised everyone with her response. Actually, he doesn't have as much power as he wants us to believe. I've been researching Mr. Kozlov's business practices since yesterday. He's made similar threats to other companies, but his follow-through is limited. He's a bully who relies on intimidation because actual corporate warfare is expensive and legally risky, even for someone with his resources. Are you willing to bet the company on that theory? Morrison challenged, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. I'm willing to bet the company on our principles, Richard replied firmly, thinking of Tommy's simple wisdom about choosing the right path. We've spent months learning what real success looks like from a 6-year-old boy. Are we going to abandon those lessons the moment they become inconvenient? The debate raged for 3 hours, voices rising and falling as board members argued about fiduciary responsibility, moral obligations, and the nature of courage in business. Some shared stories of their own children and grandchildren, wondering what they would want their families to think of their choices. Others focused on stock prices, shareholder value, and legal liability. When the vote came at 3 a.m., it was closer than Richard had hoped. 7 board members stood with him. 5 wanted to accept Kozlov's deal. But it was enough. But the real surprise came the next morning, when Tommy arrived at the office with a solution none of the adults had considered. Despite explicit instructions to stay home with the security detail, he had convinced Marcus that they needed to be part of whatever came next. "I've been thinking all night," he announced to the assembled crisis team, his small voice carrying unusual determination. "What if we used my gift to fight back instead of hide?" "What do you mean, buddy?" Richard asked, though a part of him already suspected where this was heading. "Mr. Kozlov thinks he can control us because he speaks through translators, right? But what if we recorded him saying things he wouldn't want public? What if we made him think we agreed to work with him, but we were actually gathering evidence of the bad things he wants to do?" Michael shook his head immediately, his protective instincts overriding everything else. "Tommy, that would be incredibly dangerous. We can't ask you to do that. You're 7 years old." "But I wouldn't be alone," Tommy insisted, his logic surprisingly sophisticated. "Papa would be there, and you and Mr. Richard. And I speak Russian better than his translators do. I could understand things he doesn't think anyone else can understand. I could help catch him being bad." Richard felt torn between pride and terror. Tommy was proposing to use his extraordinary gift as a weapon, not to hurt anyone, but to protect his family and expose corruption. The courage required was staggering, especially from someone so young. "The FBI has been investigating Kozlov for years," added Sarah, who had been quietly making phone calls since dawn. "Agent Martinez says if we could provide them with evidence of attempted coercion or illegal business practices, they might finally have enough to build a case. But the risks. It was risky beyond belief. They would be putting a 7-year-old child directly in the path of a man who had reportedly destroyed lives for far less provocation." But as Richard looked around the room at the people who had become his family, he realized that some fights were worth having, even if you might lose everything. "All right," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "but with every possible safeguard in place. Professional security, medical monitoring, and the moment it feels unsafe, we pull Tommy out immediately." What none of them knew was that Viktor Kozlov was far more dangerous than they'd imagined, and their plan was about to put Tommy directly in the path of a man who had learned to use fear as his primary business tool. The sting operation was set for the following Thursday at Blackstone International's conference room, with FBI agents positioned throughout the building and Tommy wearing a nearly invisible recording device that had been specially designed for children in witness protection programs. Dr. Hartwell insisted on being present to monitor Tommy's stress levels through a discreet heart rate monitor, while Marcus paced nearby like a protective lion ready to strike. Viktor Kozlov arrived precisely at 10 a.m. with an entourage that screamed danger, bodyguards with dead eyes and expensive suits, lawyers who smiled like sharks scenting blood, and translators who seemed more interested in intimidation than communication. The man himself was shorter than Richard had expected, but carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through any means necessary. "So," Kozlov said in heavily accented English, his pale eyes fixing on Tommy with uncomfortable intensity, "this is the famous child prodigy who has caused so much excitement." Tommy sat perfectly still in his specially adjusted chair, his small hands folded professionally, looking every inch the consultant he'd become despite his age. "Hello, Mr. Kozlov. I'm pleased to meet you," he said in perfect Russian, his pronunciation flawless and his tone respectfully formal. Kozlov's eyes widened slightly at Tommy's perfect accent and grammar. Most Americans who spoke Russian retained obvious foreign inflections, but Tommy sounded like he'd been born in Moscow. "Impressive, but can you handle complex materials? Materials that require discretion and maturity beyond your years?" Indeed, what followed was a test unlike anything Tommy had faced in his brief but remarkable career. Kozlov presented documents that were clearly designed to probe whether the boy could translate conversations about weapons deals, money laundering, and political corruption. Each translation was a trap designed to implicate Tommy and Blackstone International in illegal activities, while simultaneously testing the child's moral boundaries. But Tommy had prepared for this with the help of the FBI agents. Instead of translating literally, he began adding subtle interpretations that changed the meaning while remaining linguistically accurate, a technique that required incredible sophistication for someone his age. "This document discusses special metals," Tommy said carefully, his voice steady despite the pressure. "But in Russian business context, this refers to rare earth elements for legitimate manufacturing, not weapons materials." Kozlov frowned, sensing something was wrong, but unable to pinpoint exactly what through his own translator, who was clearly less skilled than the remarkable child sitting across from him. The tension in the room escalated when Kozlov grew impatient with the careful dance of translation and began speaking rapidly in Russian to his associates, not realizing Tommy understood every word perfectly. The child's eyes widened slightly as he heard explicit threats against his family, detailed plans for corporate sabotage, and casual discussions of violence that made the adults monitoring the situation exchange worried glances. "If the boy won't cooperate properly, we'll destroy them all," Kozlov hissed in Russian to his lieutenant. "The father, the CEO, everyone who has interfered with our plans. Make sure they understand what happens to people who cross us." Tommy's face remained professionally neutral, but he kept translating the official documents as if he hadn't heard the threats. Meanwhile, every word was being recorded by FBI equipment hidden throughout the room, building a case that would eventually reach federal prosecutors. The breaking point came when Kozlov, frustrated by the session's direction and Tommy's subtle resistance to his agenda, made a critical error. He grabbed Tommy's arm roughly and spoke in threatening tones that revealed his true nature. "Enough games, little boy. You will do exactly what I require, or your new family will suffer consequences that will make your father's previous poverty look like luxury." That was when Marcus exploded with paternal fury that had been building throughout the tense morning. "Get your hands off my son!" The room erupted into chaos. Bodyguards moved toward Marcus with practiced efficiency. Richard stepped protectively in front of Tommy, his own security training from military school decades earlier kicking in. Michael called for building security while positioning himself between the threats and his newfound family. And through it all, Tommy sat frozen, not by fear, but by the sudden understanding of how much danger he'd put everyone in by agreeing to this dangerous plan. "Stop!" Tommy's voice cut through the mayhem with surprising authority that silenced even the hardened criminals. "Everyone, please stop!" The room fell silent as the 7-year-old stood on his chair, his small figure somehow commanding attention from everyone present. "Mr. Kozlov," Tommy said in perfect Russian, looking directly into the oligarch's eyes with remarkable courage. "I heard what you said about destroying my family, and I want you to know that I've understood every word you've spoken today, including the parts you thought were private." Kozlov's face went white as he realized he'd been caught, his carefully constructed facade crumbling in real time. "The FBI has been listening to everything," Tommy continued, switching back to English for everyone's benefit, his young voice carrying wisdom far beyond his years. "And they've heard a very bad man threaten to hurt people I love. I think you should leave now, before you make things worse for yourself." Within minutes, FBI agents were escorting Kozlov and his entourage from the building in handcuffs, while Richard's legal team began documenting everything for federal prosecutors. The recorded evidence would eventually lead to one of the largest international corruption cases in decades. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Tommy collapsed from exhaustion and stress, his small body finally succumbing to the pressure he'd been carrying. As Dr. Hartwell examined him in the building's medical facility, she delivered sobering news that changed everything. His neural activity is off the charts. The stress from today's confrontation has pushed his brain beyond safe limits. He needs complete rest. No translations, no work, possibly for months. We came very close to permanent damage. That night, as Tommy slept under medical observation in Seattle Children's Hospital, Richard, Marcus, and Michael sat in the waiting room, processing what had happened and what it meant for their future. "We almost lost him," Marcus whispered, his voice breaking. "Not to the oligarch, but to his own gift. We pushed him too far." "But we didn't lose him," Richard replied firmly, though his own voice shook with emotion. "And now we know what we have to do. Tommy's health and happiness come first, always." The next morning would bring a decision that would change all their lives forever. But for now, they simply sat together, a family united by love and tested by fire. 6 months later, Tommy Thompson celebrated his 7th birthday not in a corporate boardroom surrounded by international executives, but in the backyard of a modest house in suburban Seattle. A house Richard had bought for Marcus and Tommy, close enough to visit daily but far enough from downtown pressure to let a little boy be exactly that. A little boy. The FBI's case against Viktor Kozlov had been successful beyond anyone's dreams. The recordings Tommy had helped gather led to arrests spanning 3 continents, asset seizures worth over $2 billion, and the dismantling of an international corruption network that had operated with impunity for decades. Blackstone International was not only safe, but had gained unprecedented credibility in international business circles as a company willing to stand up for what was right. "Make a wish, buddy," Marcus said, as Tommy leaned over his birthday cake, surrounded by an unlikely family that now included Richard, Michael, Dr. Hartwell, Sarah, and even some classmates from Tommy's new school who had no idea their friend had once been one of the most sought-after translators in the world. Tommy closed his eyes, his wish heartfelt and specific that he could keep using his gift to help people, but in ways that felt more like playing than working, more like building friendships than conducting business. "What did you wish for?" asked Michael, who had become the protective uncle Tommy had never had, complete with weekend fishing trips and bedtime story duties. "I can't tell you, or it won't come true," Tommy replied with 7-year-old seriousness that still carried echoes of his former professional demeanor. "But I can tell you what I've been thinking about." Richard leaned forward, always curious about Tommy's insights, which had become even more profound during his months of recovery and reflection. "I've been thinking that maybe my gift isn't just about speaking lots of languages. Maybe it's about helping people understand that we're all the same inside, even when we use different words to say things. Dr. Hartwell smiled from across the picnic table, her medical files showing remarkable progress. Tommy's brain scans show that his neural patterns have stabilized beautifully. The extended rest period allowed his development to catch up with his abilities. He can translate again, but with proper limits and safeguards that we'll maintain for years to come. Actually, Richard announced, producing a thick folder with obvious pride, we've found a different way for Tommy to use his gift. Something that feels more like an adventure than a job. He pulled out hundreds of letters from children around the world, kids learning English, kids struggling with communication barriers, kids from different countries who wanted pen pals who could write back in their own languages. The letters came from schools, refugee centers, international adoption agencies, and cultural exchange programs. We're starting the Tommy Thompson International Friendship Foundation, Richard explained, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who had found true purpose. Tommy can help kids talk to each other across language barriers, translate letters and messages, maybe even do video calls with children from other countries. All from home, all at his own pace, all focused on building friendships instead of business deals. Tommy's eyes lit up with pure joy, brighter than Richard had seen them since before the Kozlov incident. So I can help kids make friends with kids they couldn't talk to before? Exactly, Marcus said, ruffling his son's hair with paternal pride. And you never have to wear a business suit again, unless you want to. The foundation had already begun its work in small ways. Tommy spent his mornings in regular second-grade classes, his afternoons playing and resting, and his early evenings helping translate letters between children from different countries. The work was joyful, meaningful, and sustainable in ways that corporate consulting had never been. As the party continued around them, Richard found himself sitting quietly with Michael, watching Tommy teach his school friends how to say "Happy Birthday" in different languages, each child's face lighting up as they mastered new sounds and concepts. "You know what's funny?" Michael said, watching his father's transformation with professional and personal amazement. 6 months ago, you were a successful businessman with no family. Now you're part of something much bigger and more important. Richard nodded, thinking about how a chance encounter between a janitor and a job posting had led to this moment of perfect contentment. Sometimes the most important success isn't what you build, but what builds you. Tommy didn't just change my business. He changed my soul. Tommy ran over, chocolate cake on his cheeks and pure happiness radiating from every pore. "Mr. Richard, can we call your mum and dad and tell them about the party? I think they'd want to know that their son learned how to be part of a family." Richard's parents had been gone for 10 years, but Tommy's innocent suggestion carried deeper wisdom about connection and legacy. Maybe it was time to reach out to other family members he'd neglected, to expand this circle of love they'd accidentally created. "Actually, Tommy, I have cousins I haven't talked to in 20 years. Maybe it's time to practice what you taught me about building bridges between people." As the sun set over Seattle, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, this unlikely family cleaned up birthday decorations and shared stories about their plans for the future. Tommy would continue translating, but for children's joy rather than corporate profit. Marcus had enrolled in night school to become a certified educational coordinator, preparing to help other gifted children navigate their unique challenges. Michael was staying in Seattle permanently to help run the foundation and continue his own healing journey. And Richard had discovered that the most valuable acquisition of his career wasn't a company or a contract. It was learning how to love and be loved in return. 6 months later, the Tommy Thompson International Friendship Foundation had connected children from 47 countries, facilitated thousands of cross-cultural friendships, and reminded adults worldwide that understanding begins with simple human connection. The foundation had become a model for child-centered international outreach, with requests for similar programs coming from schools and organizations around the globe. And every evening around that same small kitchen table where it all began, four people who had found each other against impossible odds shared dinner and dreams, proving that families aren't just born, they're built, one translated word and one shared meal at a time. The language of the heart, it turned out, was universal after all. And sometimes the most important conversations happen not in boardrooms or conference calls, but around kitchen tables where love was the only currency that mattered.